Hi, everyone, and welcome to this training, Trauma in the Brain, Caring for Children Who Have Experienced Trauma. It is Alex Torres, your BSF trainer. We miss you guys, and we are looking forward to hosting our face-to-face live workshop soon, hopefully. But again, thank you for being here. And this is also considered an ISFC training. So you will get your hours. So normally this is 2 hours for our online, and for ISFC, it would be 3. So afterwards, we are counting the quiz time as an additional half an hour. And then if you're an ISFC parent, please contact us so we can give you some assignments to make up for the additional 30 minutes. So thank you for being here. And I want to encourage you to have a pen and paper ready so that you can take notes, and we will be pausing throughout the training to do some reflection and inner work that we have for you. So thank you again for being here, and we will go ahead and get started. So I will pull up the training. All right, here we go. So caring for children that have experienced trauma. Our goal for this training is to help you define what trauma is. And for many of you, this might be a recap, but I highly always encourage you to be open to learning something new. Every time that I give this training, I always learn something new, and new information arises. So I'm always open to learning something from these trainings. Also, we want to help you understand exactly how trauma may impact the children that you care for in different areas, especially behaviors. We understand that usually the behaviors is where the challenge shows up. And we also want to help you understand how trauma impacts general development, including emotional, cognitive, social, and educational. And then finally, we want to help you identify ways that you can support your children if they have experienced trauma. And we're going to assume that everyone in care has experienced trauma. I need to just look at my timer. I gotta make sure that my timer is there. Okay, perfect. All right, let's move forward. So what is trauma? Trauma is something that's too much, too soon, too fast. And overall trauma, it's not so much the event in itself that is traumatic, but the way that the person, the child, experiences the trauma, how they process the trauma. Also, trauma affects many areas of the being. So it's not just something that affects the child cognitively, but it affects the child's nervous system, which you see that a lot of children have external reactions to trauma, and which ends up showing up in attitudes and behaviors, right? Also, the National Institute of Mental Health describes trauma as a normal reaction to an extreme event, which is, it's not abnormal, right? To react in a certain way when there's been a sense of fear or hopelessness, or you fear you're gonna die. It is important to remember that it is not necessarily the event in itself that causes trauma, but a person's thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and experiences surrounding the event. How common is trauma? 70% of adults have experienced some type of trauma event at least once in their lives. That is 223.4 million people in the US. In public behavioral health, over 90% of clients have experienced trauma. What we know about trauma is that it can result from adverse childhood experiences, which we will be actually showing you a video about ACEs. Many of our returning parents have probably heard of ACEs, and actually there's a quick quiz that you can take online. Natural disasters, early, severe, and chronic trauma can affect the brain, which can result in behaviors and emotions that appear maladaptive. Trauma has an extreme high correlation with poor health and social outcomes, and parental substance abuse, parental depression, poverty, abuse and neglect, lack of support systems, witnessing domestic violence, and child's own experience of trauma, especially multiple traumas. When children are exposed to trauma, particularly chronic and complex trauma, their downstairs brain gets a lot of practice. That's our fight, flight, and freeze. So that is on overload. You know, it's like, okay, we got to keep working. We got to keep working because we're experiencing these things, and I got to keep you alive. You know, it's like if you're going hiking and you see a mountain lion, your fight or flight is going to go on override, and it's going to kick in, right? Well, imagine these kids waking up to a mountain lion every day, and they're just constantly on this override of a fight, flight, or freeze. The brain is rewired to prepare for a world of constant danger. And, you know, I hear a lot of parents say, like, well, you know, they've been in my home for 6 months, and, you know, you might be the best thing that ever happened to them on a external level, meaning that they are receiving the love that they never had. They're receiving the adequate food. They are, you know, in a safe environment, but it takes a while for the brain to actually receive them, say, oh, okay, we're safe. The downstairs brain becomes overdeveloped and the upstairs brain becomes underdeveloped. So we will be diving into that part of the brain. The upstairs brain is the one that helps us reason, emotional balance, and all that good stuff, right? The upstairs brain is responsible for calming the downstairs brain when it is in the state of fear, but if underdeveloped, the downstairs brain operates unchecked. So now let's look at different types of trauma. There's, There's acute trauma, there's chronic trauma, there's system-induced trauma, complex trauma, and vicarious trauma. So acute trauma is a single trauma event that is limited in time. So for example, maybe you were a witness to a car accident, or you got in a car accident, or maybe you got bit by a dog. You know, it's just a one-time event. Chronic trauma is the experience of multiple traumatic events. So let's say your parents are abusing drugs and they beat you, or you're getting sexually abused by a family member on a regular basis, or your mom doesn't feed you because she's struggling with her depression, forgets to take care of your basic needs. Complex trauma over here is exposure to chronic trauma and the impact such exposure has on the individual, but also adding other components. So let's say that complex trauma could be like your mom doesn't feed you, and when she drinks alcohol, she beats you, and then you also live in a gang-infested environment where you're constantly hearing gunshots and seeing people get beat up and arrested. So that would be complex trauma. And then, of course, system-induced trauma is just the initial effects of the system, being removed from your home, going from home to home, having to go to court, all this stuff is system-induced trauma. Having different social workers, changing schools, all these other components that are unfortunately part of the system. And then vicarious trauma, that would be something that you as foster parents experience, a secondary trauma. So secondary trauma is basically, it's hearing the stories, it's seeing how trauma has affected your children. That in itself can also affect you. It doesn't mean that you necessarily experience the trauma, but just hearing and witnessing how it's affected them, that can affect your emotional and overall well-being, mental well-being as well. So neurotransmitters and hormones, too much cortisol. The dendrites in the brain shrink and the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus impair communication between neurons and leaves the area undeveloped. So this is what happens when there's too much cortisol. And cortisol is relieved and released in moments of stress, right? Early life adversity and toxic stress is associated with an increased frequency of disorders such as obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular problems, as well as substance abuse, depression, and anti-social behaviors. So times of stress stimulate cortisol, and if stress is too high for too long, it becomes toxic, just like anything. I mean, it is good to release cortisol at a balance because it helps you, right? It helps you when you're in danger, but higher cortisol levels could harm cognitive processes, subdue immune system, and inflammatory reactions, or heighten the risk for affective disorders. Too much stress and high levels of cortisol slow down the prefrontal cortex processing, which is key to controlling impulsivity such as aggression, anxiety, mood, and overall self-regulation. And children who have experienced trauma have high levels of excitatory neurotransmitters. Also, trauma, sorry about that. Trauma is not just a cognitive experience, it is embedded in our system. It's like literally encoded in you. All those memories, your body is your subconscious mind, and for children, a lot of the times their brain is not fully developed to be able to process the experiences that they've gone through. So it's easy to like forget about it, but the body remembers. So your body is like your subconscious. So all of their traumas have been encoded in their body. Then there's 3 types of stress. There's positive stress, tolerable, and toxic. And positive stress is like, hey, I'm getting a new job and I'm a little nervous. I'm gonna, things are gonna change. I'm getting a promotion, the new position. That's good. That's positive stress. And then there's tolerable. Sometimes we tolerate the stress of, I have to get up early, take the kids to school, and then go to work. Sometimes that can be stressful, right? You're having to do a lot in 1 hour. And then there's, of course, toxic stress. It's continuously be affecting you on an emotional and physical level, and it's not being alleviated. I want to show you guys this video. I'm going to only show you about half of it, and it's just a quick intro. We actually took this training, our staff, but it's a intro to understanding a little bit more about somatic approach to trauma, basically how trauma affects your body.
Hi there, Dr. Applebaum here. I am the Director of Somatic Psychology at John County University. I'm really excited to share with you a new course that I'm teaching here. It's called Somatic Approaches to Trauma. So here's what we know about trauma. Trauma is not just a cognitive experience. Trauma is not just something that we can address from a cognitive perspective, because everything that we're learning about trauma, from the most recent advances in neuroscience, from research on the relationship between trauma and so many different bodily disorders of dysfunction, autoimmune disorders, digestive disorders, endocrine disorders, all of these things where trauma impacts our level of bodily stress, cardiovascular disease, all of these things, that trauma is not just a thinking thing. It's not just a prefrontal cortex disease. It's not just an error of executive functioning or cognitive labeling that cannot be solved simply by cognitive reframing. Right? No matter how hard we try, because trauma is embedded into our system. Trauma is a bodily experience, not just a cognitive one. And because trauma is a bodily experience, a somatic experience, something which impacts our amygdala and our heart rate and our nervous system, we cannot simply solve people's trauma issues through cognitive techniques alone. We have to address the body, we have to listen to the body, we have to try to help the body recalibrate its way through trauma. So that's why I created this course, because there's so much lack of inclusion of the body perspective, the somatic perspective, and trauma that way. So what this course is going to cover, we're going to talk about what trauma is from a somatic perspective. This notion of bodily overwhelm, what happens to the nervous system when your brain is experiencing trauma, what happens to your amygdala, what happens to your thalamus, what happens to Broca's area. So there's going to be a neurophysiological component to understanding what happens to your brain and what happens to your body when you're experiencing trauma. We're going to be looking at the distinction between the different kinds of trauma: shock trauma, developmental trauma, complex trauma, family trauma, cultural trauma. We'll talk about some of the major concepts that run through all the somatic trauma literature. Notions of titration, pendulation, somatic resourcing, grounding, centering, orienting. All of these are really important counterpoints to some of the other techniques that have been proposed out there. Fundamental notions like the window of tolerance. There have been certain kind of trauma methodologies proposed which endorse things like flooding and exposure. And while there is some truth and some value to those methodologies, if you don't have understandings of things like the window of tolerance or titration or pendulation to safely navigate the exposure that you're planning to do, there's a serious danger of re-traumatizing an individual rather than helping them. So we'll be covering all of those concepts in this curriculum. Some of what we are going to be covering as well are fundamental foundational notions of somatic psychology. First, what it is, where it came from, and this fundamental notion of the felt sense. What it means to actually feel into the body, into the place that has no words, this place that is this emergent process of something trying to come out of us, right? So listening for that felt sense, the somatic experience of what is on the edge of wanting to come forward. So we'll talk about the felt sense, the felt shift, using the process and learning the process of dual awareness, how to help somebody who's being sucked into a trauma vortex, right? Learn the process of dual awareness so that they can shuttle back and forth and hopefully return to safety when they're being sucked away in a world that feels dramatically unsafe. So this is a very full course, a very full curriculum, and a very important one. If you are a health professional who deals with trauma, a psychotherapist, a psychologist,
All right, and the rest is just informational in regards to like mental health professionals. So we'll skip this. All right, so really quick, what the doctor said is that trauma impacts the body. The body remembers what the mind forgets. It is not the event, it's the way that we respond to the event. And trauma emerges as a result of the way in which our body and nervous system responds to the external stimulus. The body and mind split during trauma, so it's fragmented. And we need to create a cohesiveness with the mind and the body, right? Okay. One of the things that he did mention was cultural trauma. And it's something that I want to briefly talk about because it's important to acknowledge the population that we serve. Mostly of the children here in Fresno County that are in the system are brown and African-American children. They're colored children. And it's important to also take in consideration how cultural and ancestral trauma has affected us. So that could be another component to their overall development. And this video is actually about the Aboriginal people, which are the natives in Australia, and how cultural intergenerational trauma has affected them, which is very similar to a lot of people like the African American culture, the Hispanic culture, and even the Native American culture here in the US.
The story of our communities, people, and nation starts a long, long time ago. More than 60,000 years, in fact. This was when our culture and our law first started to thrive. We knew who we were and where we belonged. We took care of each other, our land and our waters. We ate food that made us healthy, lived on country and abided by our laws and song lines. Our families, our children were happy, with strong minds and hearts, because they were where they belonged. But then, everything changed.
Colonization came, bringing wars, disease, famine, violence, and the destruction and violation of our cultural laws, sacred sites, families, and communities.
We were denied our knowledge, language, ceremonies, and identity. The very things that tell us who we are and where we belong. And our connections with each other and the land grew weak.
And then our children were taken from us. They had their names changed and their identities stripped away. They were told that Aboriginal people were bad. Worse still, they were told that their parents and grandparents did not want them.
For years this happened, and those children became known as the stolen generations.
Our children were denied love and experienced physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. This left very deep, very complex, and very real wounds, leaving scars that are still being felt personally, socially, spiritually, and collectively.
In the time when our story started, we were able to parent in the cultural way that has seen our families survive and thrive for generations. Our people were strong, and our culture flowed and healed us in times of hurt.
But since the trauma of colonization and the stolen generations, we have not been able to heal in the same way. And we have unknowingly passed this trauma on to our children through sharing our sad stories and having them witness and experience our pain. This is known as intergenerational trauma, and we see symptoms today in broken relationships, disconnected families, violence, suicide, and drug and alcohol abuse.
But this is not where our story ends. We still have strong minds and hearts, and we still know who we were and where we belong. By creating safe and strong communities together, supporting our families to be free from pain, returning to our culture and building a strength of identity, we can stop the cycle of trauma and bring about positive intergenerational change so that we can continue to thrive for the next 60,000 years. There are simple things that we can all do to help heal our trauma.
Visit healingfoundation.org.au to find out more.
I want you to take a few minutes to reflect on this video and write down in your journal, how has this impacted you? What did you learn about this video? Is there something that you can relate to from this video? So we'll take a few minutes and then we will resume. Alrighty. Let me make sure, yes, we are on. All right, so ACEs study is the Center for Disease and Control and Kaiser Permanente did this collaboration. And it was a study over 10 years, and it looked at the effects of adverse childhood experiences, trauma over these individuals' lifespan. And it's been one of the largest study ever done on this subject. And we are gonna watch a video about it. And the video is not here, hold on. Let's see. One moment.